right, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. Today on the pod, a man who has put me in the same writerly company as David Frum, the late Hugh Segal, Speer and Guy Giorno, among other notables. What I'm doing there, alongside a number of Team Blue stalwarts, contributing a chapter to my guest Alister Campbell's new book, The Harris Legacy, Reflections on a Transformational Premier, you may have some questions about. I'll get to those today and a hell of a lot more in my chat with Alister, who's been the CEO of several Canadian insurance companies. My spell check changes his name to A-lister, so that's probably right. Back in 1995, he was the message guy for Mike Harris's Common Sense Revolution, responsible for policy, speech, communications, advertising, and media. It's a big job, and it went well. We'll dive into the book and examine the question, after 7 years of fundamental change in Ontario under Harris, do we still live in Mike Harris's Ontario today? Alister, it's really great to have you here on the Herle Burly. Thanks for making the time.
Pumped to be here.
So let's start with this. You and I both share a great love for the Canadian Football League, and you'll note my George Reed jersey hanging in the background. That was a tough day yesterday.
Condolences on the loss.
Yeah.
He was a landmark figure on a team that really needed landmarks. So an extraordinary, I think he still holds the record for most rushing touchdowns in the CFL.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. He was a great player. He was a great man. And in those days in Regina, you got to know all the guys because they lived there. So I played with his kids in sports. I played with his son Keith in sports and played with Lancaster's kids. It was a very fun time to be growing up in Regina.
Well, speaking of fun times, I had the privilege of being at the Grey Cup in Regina just last November and watching my Argos win on the final play of the game. It was about as good as you can get.
Yeah, it's a good place to watch a football game.
The most of the Saskatchewan folks were quietly cheering for Toronto because while they don't like Toronto, they hate it. So it was all pretty simple. Oh,
absolutely. The Riders sucked this year, so I'm all go Argos. Fair enough. All right, so we're here to talk about a new book that you have curated and helped write. You roped me into it as well. It's a compendium of essays on former Premier Mike Harris's time in office. So that was almost 30 years ago. So what's the impetus for this book now?
Yeah, fair question. So it was one of these kind of side-of-the-desk COVID projects. And there had been this little spasm of media attention to this long-past premier when the current premier appointed Mike Harris to the Order of Ontario, whatever that is.
It's better than King's Council.
Easily.
Yeah.
Easily. So the media coverage was brief, but it was intriguing to me. So, the Toronto Star went nuts and pulled out old columns and old columnists who were still alive and still filled with hate. But what struck me was more the younger journalists who were told by some editor to fill column inches. So they did what a good young reporter would do and went to Google. And what they got was a very narrow version of history. They got Walkerton and Ipperwash and satanic levels of austerity that left thousands of nurses and teachers starving homeless in the streets of Ontario. Oh, and selling the 407 for peanuts on the dollar to foreign interests. So I remember that time as having more meaningful issues and more profound changes than that. And it struck me that maybe I'm just old and don't remember it properly, or maybe there was something more to the story that needed to be told. And politics has cycles to it, and history has cycles to it. And so over time, try and get to balance. And it struck me that maybe it was time to try to get to balance on the Harris legacy. And that led me to see if I could recruit some folks to write different chapters of that story. So that was kind of the initial impetus, a feeling like maybe it was time to file a minority report. Maybe it was time to initiate a process of revisionist history. Maybe it was just a time to try and find better balances to a time I thought was pretty profound and important in Ontario's history, but had been kind of condensed to a short list of memes.
Did you feel that the record was misunderstood or not remembered?
Misunderstood, and I think to some degree, honestly, misrepresented. And part of it is just because other people are telling their narratives. I listened to your fantastic interview with former Minister Tobin in this podcast series, and I heard a beautiful recital of the message track of the Chrétien Liberals. We inherited this $41 billion deficit. We did superhuman things. And then at the end, and perhaps did we in retrospect maybe cut the provinces too hard and too fast and in the wrong ways? Perhaps, but net, we were just fantastic. And that's an important message track. But if we think about how challenged Canada was in that time, I think it's fundamentally unfair to leave out the contributions of the major provinces in Canada to righting the ship. And on that list, I would include Premier Harris and probably also Premier Klein in Alberta, who made meaningful contributions to rebalancing the federation and rebalancing.
Although I might just say, because it's personal to me, because I'm from Saskatchewan, that perhaps nobody paid a bigger political price for that than the NDP in Saskatchewan.
Super fair, absolutely. The consequences of the Martin cuts and the reality that those were directly against healthcare and welfare at a time of high unemployment and growing healthcare costs. These were big structural shifts in how the federal provincial funding models worked. And in the case of Klein, he managed to get to balanced budget anyway. But as I think is really important to appreciate, Ontario was going through the worst recession it had ever had. Mm-hmm. Because you had this globalization, deindustrialization trend going on. And so Klein had oil revenues to help him get to balance. He only had a spending problem, and he managed his spending and managed to absorb the federal cuts. Ontario had a spending problem at the end of Peterson and Ray, but they also had a tax problem. Ray had raised taxes 3 times over 18 months in his regime and got less revenue each time. He'd hit a ceiling. And so Harris had to work out how to cut spending, cut taxes, and absorb the scope and scale of the federal Liberal Chrétien Martin cuts. And he did all of those things successfully. And that's not on Wikipedia today. And so, that's the kind of thought process that I thought was worth trying to articulate in this retrospective collection of essays.
Okay, I want to talk lots of policy with you from that time, but I first want to start with some fun politics. I mean, there's a reason that you put together this book, and that is because you were one of the main people behind the Harris movement, one of the key drivers of that thing. And it's quite a remarkable story. The story of the common sense revolution as a document itself. These are the things I wrote about in the book, but I'm interested to hear your version of them because you've heard mine. And in the lead up to the 1995 election, the PCs were running a poor third in public support. Nobody that I knew thought they had any chance to be the government in the foreseeable future in Ontario. Bob Rae and the NDP were governing, and it was the surest bet in the world that Lynn MacLeod and the Liberals were going to replace them after the 1995 election. So tell us the backstory of how Harris won that election.
Yeah, it was a long bomb. There's no doubt about it. We were 30 points down, and I think we went into the election, writ period, roughly 30 points down, and we won a landslide 6 weeks later. So that doesn't happen very often in democratic politics, period, much less in traditionally staid and balanced Ontario. But Ontario was clearly seeking change, major change. They'd already initiated that by a decade before by shedding 42 years of Tory rule for David Peterson. They did it again, even if by accident, electorally, electing Bob Rae and the NDP. Ontario was oscillating through the parties, trying to find somebody with a plan and a strategy to get the province back to being kind of the economic central linchpin of Canada. And so there was an appetite for a plan. And there was a clear appetite for major change. And so it was that major change theme that led to the creation of the Common Sense Revolution as a clearly articulated platform of comprehensive and fundamental change to Ontario.
Let's just stop there.
Go ahead.
Let's just stop there and focus on the name, because it's a great fucking name. And I notice that Poilievre has stolen the common sense part of it now, right? Assuming that people associate the revolution part of it with him. Where did you come up with that name? It's brilliant.
It was a team thing. Some of us were more on the revolutionary bomb throwing side of conservatism. And some of the staff around Mike, who'd been with him from North Bay, kept saying, well, he's not really a revolutionary. And as David Frum beautifully describes in his foreword to the book, there's a unique Canadian way of finding balance between perhaps normally unreconcilable things. Progressive conservative would be an example of that. I think he also cites conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription as another. Common Sense Revolution turned out to be a beautifully effective brand. I mean, it's very rare for any platform to be remembered 30 years later, and that brand still resonates. But the balance that we struck in that name was very important to who Mike was and what our party was. We meant to do big things, but we meant to do sensible things. And I think one of my favorite lines from Mike was that in the end, bringing common sense to government appeared to be a revolutionary idea, but it wasn't really. It was just being sensible. And that kind of we kept coming back to this sense of a person as a leader who was fundamentally decent and aiming to do the right things. But there was some tough work ahead, and he was ready to do it. And that was all part and parcel of the branding. The other point I'll remind you is that the brand Progressive Conservative was toxic nuclear waste. It was radioactive in 95. The federal PC party, which had been governing Canada for 2 majority terms, was almost obliterated from the political map of Canada in 93. And so we effectively had to create a separate and new brand for the party in order for people to listen to us. So that was part of the calculation as well, David.
Right. So the Common Sense Revolution itself, the program, so if I could just be sloppy in my history, I would say that traditionally election platforms had been things that were concocted by the campaign team to solicit votes. And if those things had anything to do with the program the party would follow in government, that was serendipitous largely rather than deliberate. They were campaign exercises, not substantive policy exercises in large measure. Yours was completely different from that. Why?
Well, I think sometimes the political strategy to win requires policy, and sometimes it doesn't. If you think about, for instance, Premier Ford's most recent landslide majority, I defy you to remember a policy from it. But in 95, get it done. I mean, it was just a theme. Mm-hmm. But in 95, there was this clear appetite for policy and change. Like, what would we actually do to fix all of the challenges facing Ontario? And so there were a group of us who were policy nerds. And so we lucked out to connect our timing in this game to a campaign that actually needed who we were and what we could bring. So also, I would add that the party had done some pretty deep thinking about itself. And so we had all these grassroots party policy councils formed. And so when we started assembling the platform, we had actually quite a lot of good work that came out of caucus and our grassroots party members to draw from. What did we put in the window? Of course, we put in the window the things we thought that would resonate and get votes. But every single candidate we nominated was nominated after we launched the platform. We ran training programs on the platform. Candidates had to pass an exam on the contents of the platform. And so we made it very clear internally that it was the intent of the Harris team when elected to implement what was in this platform. So our party was ready for that. Our caucus was ready for that. Our cabinet was ready for that. And that really is a pretty rare phenomenon, just in terms of a whole coherent flow from campaign strategy to government execution. Very rare, I think.
It was National Day for Truth and Reconciliation this past Saturday. Most of you super engaged Herle Burly-ites were aware of that, I'm sure. Maybe you even showed your solidarity by wearing an orange shirt. I'm glad there's a day set aside to reflect and do some truth-telling about the abject tragedy of our residential school system. But let's be honest, reconciliation, a word inherently about action, should be more of a 365-day-a-year thing, eh? Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, believes exactly that, and they've been acting on it for years now. They were the first technology company to formalize their commitment to reconciliation through their Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan. The plan was built in full partnership with Indigenous peoples. It was their voices and input that guided it, and it adheres to Indigenous-led frameworks for reconciliation. There are 4 pillars. Connectivity is about collaborating with Indigenous governments to get communities connected to high-speed internet. Here's the progress on that. TELUS services 240 Indigenous communities. By year-end 2023, 123 communities and 271 reserves and treaty settlement lands will be connected to TELUS Pure Fiber and coax networks. And along with the transformative power of 5G, 575 Indigenous lands have been connected across Canada, with more to come. Enabling social outcomes is about going beyond that connectivity to create programs that help communities achieve long-term prosperity. Cultural responsiveness and relationships is about listening, learning, and acting in ways that ensure culturally responsive experiences for Indigenous customers. And finally, economic reconciliation, supporting sustainable economic participation and growth for Indigenous peoples through meaningful involvement in TELUS's business. Herle Burly-ites, these are just the broadest strokes of how TELUS supports Indigenous reconciliation. But know this, they are committed to driving real change here. Every target is measurable and reported on, and every commitment has a timeline that spurs real action. You can learn more about it all at telus.com/reconciliation. What do you think was going on in Canada at that time? Because, I mean, the other exception to my rule about platforms, or my thing about platforms, was the Federal Liberal Red Book, which, while less controversial and less prescriptive than the Common Sense Revolution, was nonetheless a far more substantive document that people were used to being produced in election campaigns. So you think there was something about the challenges facing Canada at that time that parties felt compelled to respond more substantively than they had in the past to it?
I totally think that's right. We actually paid a lot of attention to the success of the Red Book in the design and thinking around the Common Sense Revolution. I think the most important difference was that we made it much more content rich, and we wanted everybody to read it, not just see it. So the Red Book was waived. We printed.
It was important that it existed. It wasn't important what was in it.
It was to be waived. Ours was to be read. We printed 2.5 million copies in a province that wasn't quite yet 11 million citizens. It was meant to be seen and read and maybe even absorbed, because we were pretty sure the contents would help convince folks that we actually had a platform that was going to bring major change that would benefit them. And that was the ballot question. You know, the science of campaigns, you're supposed to have a message and you're supposed to have a ballot question. And as our dear departed friend John Duffy would say, every campaign has a message. Sometimes it's deliberate. And I know we both miss him. But a ballot question is supposed to be short and tight. Reagan looking into the camera and saying, ask yourself this question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that was the death of Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
In our case, we had a 3-part ballot question because 30 points behind, we had to really get to a complicated thought process. And our question was, which of these 3 lying weasels do we trust the most to bring Ontario real change that will benefit me?
Okay.
And that was, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the others as the first part of that. The second part was major change. So that was work for welfare and big tax cuts and a commitment to actually cut the size of government and scrapping affirmative action, hiring quotas, things that nobody said out loud, and we said them all. But to benefit me, the third part of that was clearly attached to the tax cut. And in your thoughtful conclusion of your chapter, you come back to a profound reflection on the lasting impact of the Harris tax cutting regime, Ontario and Canada. Different folks can come to different conclusions. I find that a very motivating sentence. I think you meant it to be depressing. But I think the combination of all of that to get to an answer to a 3-part ballot question was how we achieved a 30-point movement in 6 weeks, because Ontario and Canada were looking for change and specific plans and somebody they believed would actually do it.
Right. Can we talk about Mike Harris for a sec? So Mike Harris was not somebody who, there had been a lot of, leadership turmoil in the PC party subsequent to Mr. Davis's resignation. Harris was never one of the top names mentioned in those days. There was Larry Grossman's and people like that were the Emilion Gris of the party, and then gradually they all drifted away. And people derided Mike Harris. He's a golf pro from North Bay. What does he know about anything? And then you guys were all super smart, all the people around Harris. And so there's you, and there's Leslie Noble, and there's Tom Long, and there's Jamie Watt, and I could go on and on about the people that were involved in that thing. And it leaves me with the question, what was Mike Harris's role in the design of the victory and in the execution of the victory?
So there is a special kind of person who is comfortable being underestimated. That person is not you or me. If people don't think I'm smart, it drives me crazy. Mm-hmm. It's psychic. I have low self-esteem, and I need to be validated by other people's perception of me. Mike regarded being underestimated as an advantage, like playing poker and having people think you're the patsy when they are.
Right.
And Mike Harris had spent 10 years sitting on the back benches at Queen's Park. There was no public policy file that he didn't know frontwards and backwards and understand comprehensively what the stakeholder map was. He had watched the top tier of Davis cabinet ministers, the Darcy McHughs, all the way through to the Timbrells and Grossmans. So he'd been a student of the process and a student of public policy. And he was totally cool if people thought he was just a golf pro from North Bay. And he had spent his entire life being underestimated. In 1990, he, I think, had only been leader for a few weeks when Peterson called his snap election. And we stumbled through that campaign because we had no money. But he performed well, and we picked up a couple of seats. But he built this tax fighter brand. And he had done well enough that the party was ready to wait another 5 years with him as leader. Mm-hmm. By the time we got to the 95 campaign, Mike had assembled this team. We all went in with different versions of the campaign. So he pulled
you in? You didn't all get together and go to him? Like, how did that happen?
He asked each of us. It was a very frustrating process for each of us. He asked each of us to come with our plan for how to structure the campaign team. And we each went in with some version of put me in charge and I'll go take it from there. And then he was the one who structured the team and chose who would be campaign chair, campaign manager, with David Lindsay as the tiebreaker, chief of staff. Tom and Leslie were highly ambivalent about working together. All of us had the history of our different leadership contests within the party. Mike put the team together the way he wanted it. You're going to play bass, you're going to play drums, you're going to play lead. And then he had his hands in the whole thing. And when people, ascribe authorship of the Common Sense Revolution platform, once again, Mike's totally cool if other people think somebody else did that, but that was his platform. And we just enabled his effective leadership.
Right. Did you know that your program was going to be as socially disruptive as it was? Those were tumultuous times. Did you anticipate that?
We anticipated it to some extent. In fact, we sought it in that period after we launched the platform in May of '94. I mean, you know how Canada works. You're an ace at the federal game. You know how Saskatchewan works. But if you ask people in Saskatchewan which government they think about first, they think about the province first, and then they think about Ottawa second. Ontario is unique. We're the only province.
Although they do think about Justin Trudeau a lot out in Saskatchewan these days.
They do. There's good reasons for that, and that's a separate podcast, I suspect. Ontario is different. Ontario looks at Ottawa first, and then the third news item is going to be, and something happened at Queen's Park today. And if something happened, it's because the government announced something. To be the third place party leader.
Ask Marit Stiles about it. Like, you just can't get any profile if you're in opposition.
So we launched the platform 18 months in advance, deliberately with some pointy edges to the thing, designed to cause conflict and gain attention. And it really was a maddening process of trying to pick fights with people who didn't even know we were there.
Right.
So yes, we expected it to be a combustible force when we got to the campaign. And we expected a conflict when we were in government. But the scope and scale of the resistance from the public sector unions, in retrospect, is a really big thing. And I don't think it just reflects on Mike or the Common Sense Revolution. Somewhere in that period running up to that, David, the public sector unions became convinced they were somehow the coal miners. And their leadership convinced themselves that they all needed to be Arthur Scargill. And if you think about the transition period, it started really with Ray. Like Bob Ray was dealing with a massive deficit and a terrible recession. And he tried to introduce a very nuanced and coherent plan called the social contract, which was going to protect public sector union jobs and still allow Ontario to regain some stable financial footing. And it ripped his party apart. The response was kind of tectonic. And I think in the course of that, he ended up discovering he might not actually be an NDPer after all, and began his migration to the center. Yeah. But the idea that the public sector unions need to be at perpetual war with whoever's in government kind of came from before Harris, but the Common Sense Revolution made that live. And I think about, the long-term impact of that, but I also think of the way it's kind of infected some of the more challenging recent periods. I think the inability of the teachers' unions, for instance, to collaborate with governments in the COVID period, when there was just this clear, overwhelming evidence that kids needed to be in school. But there was totally legitimate public health and safety questions for teachers being in those classrooms. There had to be a Team Canada way to think about that. And the unions couldn't do that because they were at perpetual war with whoever was the minister. And that was most unfortunate for Canada. And I don't think Harris caused that, but it's certainly a lasting part of his legacy that the tensions were as extreme as they became in that period.
Okay. So I want you to go way outside of my comfort zone because I'm the furthest thing from a philosopher, but I'm interested in what the intellectual grounding of the Common Sense Revolution was. Because, you use the word common sense, which implies the kind of wisdom you hear at the coffee shop among people. But when I read about you guys, I hear obviously that you were influenced by foreign politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, but also that you were influenced by philosophers, Friedrich Hayek, somebody I'm not familiar with, and things like that. Where did the thinking about how, because like I said, you weren't a campaign that said, here's a couple of ideas that will attract some votes. You were a campaign that said, we're going to reshape the government of Ontario. So where did that come from?
So in the introductory chapter to the Harris Legacy book, and I guess if I was a proper marketer, I would have held it up and shown people a copy. But the introductory chapter, I call it the antecedents to revolution, and I try and tease that question out specifically. So there were folks who read Hayek, and I recommend The Road to Serfdom to you. It could change your life. But there were those of us who read that, but I wouldn't think Mike was one of them. And there were other forces at play, and there was a lot of stuff about reinventing government, and that was not just from the right. The New Zealand government had done this massive restructuring and tried to have the Public Service Act more like the private sector. Al Gore was talking about reinventing government and trying to think about how to modernize the way services were delivered. There were a whole bunch of folks working on this file, and that was part of things. There is no doubt the Reagan tax cuts and the kind of Kemp-Roth changes in the U.S. Were a factor. And there was no doubt that the confident declaration about lower taxes and more freedom will lead to better outcomes all the way through the social strata, which was a core element of the Thatcher regime. Those were all in the mix. It was a soup. Yep. And out of that, we brewed the common sense revolution. I would say that the common sense element of it, though, if we go through the checklist, which maybe we'll have a chance to do on this podcast, around some of the changes, many of them were big ideas, but they were logical outcomes of how do we cut spending by this much, cut taxes by this much, and still balance the budget. And the arithmetic that we explained to folks over and over again was that we're going to have to achieve $6 billion, $4 billion through spending, $2 billion through taxes, and it's going to work. And most important, it was going to create 725,000 net new jobs in Ontario in 5 years, which it did. By luck, by judgment, by some combination of the two. So long answer to your question is there were lots of different forces at play that led to the content of the CSR as it got branded. But policy area by policy area, it was still informed by lots of practical Ontario progressive conservative thinking over the decades. And they were just things that needed to be done.
So, you probably don't realize it, but you have a lot of train terminology floating around in your head that you don't recognize as train terminology. But it is. You might talk about making the grade, or maybe blowing off steam. You might have bought a new car and splurged on all the bells and whistles. Sidetracked, third rail, wrong side of the tracks, blowing smoke, fast-tracked, railroaded, just the ticket, the end of the line. I could go on. Fact is, railroading language has infiltrated English so thoroughly that you probably don't even know you're using it. Interesting, eh? Anyway, the folks at our sponsor, CN, know a thing or two about railroad terms, and their favorite one at the moment is another oldie, leaving the station on time. The thing is, at CN, they mean it literally. Come hell or high water, as one of our former prime ministers liked to say, CN trains leave the station on time, period. In the past year and a half, leaving the station on time and arriving on time has become a prime directive at the railway. It's actually more complicated than it sounds. CN basically has tracks connecting the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico. In some places, there are sidings for trains to park on, and other parts of the network are double-tracked. But it's not like an endless 6-lane highway. Leaving the station on time means making sure the tracks ahead are clear, and coordinating the dozens of 2-mile-long trains rolling along the network at any given moment, not to mention making sure they're loaded on time and there's someone waiting to unload them at the other end so they can start another long haul. But CN has been doing it, and as a result, the velocity of CN's trains hasn't been as good in years. To most of the world, velocity means speed, but to a railway, it means the average number of miles its trains cover in a day. And what that crucial number means is good service, as in, making the trains run on time. Where service is concerned, CN has sort of a one-track mind, tunnel vision even. So you've lived 30 years since then. You're an observant person. Do you still think the same things you thought back then? Or if you were writing the Common Sense Revolution now, how would it differ?
Super question. I feel like I'm a more empathetic listener than I used to be, personally. I suspect that is true of you as well. Because when we first met, I think we both enjoyed talking at each other. But in terms of how much of it would be in there again, almost all of it, David. I still believe lower taxes are better than higher taxes. I still believe that keeping a balance of private sector to public sector that is more private than public is better. I still believe the private sector does a better job of most forms of service delivery than government. I still believe there's things that government does better than the private sector. They should be defined, they should be understood, and they should be executed well, and they should be funded properly. I think it's better if you're working than if you're on welfare. That checklist of what was in the platform then and what I believe now, I don't think has fundamentally deviated. And as I try to tease out from the different chapters in this book, that's not just a conservative view. Despite the controversies of the time, almost nothing Harris did was reversed by the governments you were part of in the years afterwards. The city of Toronto was not unmerged. The monolith of Ontario Hydro was not reconstituted. Nobody put welfare compensation rates for able-bodied people back up to the crazily high levels that Peterson and Ray had elevated them to. Nobody thought it was a good idea to return negotiating power to 78 amateur boards of education against the most powerful and organized union in North America at the OSSTF. The list goes on. The Oak Ridges Moraine is still unpaved, would be a nice example. Nobody's decided we should start burning coal again, which Harris began the process of getting rid of. The giant expansion of parkland, first jurisdiction in the world to get to the 12% of geographical space designated as parkland, the UN biodiversity holy grail. Mike did it. Nobody's decided to claw back that parkland and turn it into paved development. The list goes on a long way.
Tell me about the coal plants for a second, because when you were in office, only Maurice Strong in the world was talking about climate change, really. It was not an issue in Canada, right? So why did you close the coal plant? Why did you start the process? The Liberals claim they closed the coal plants, and they closed most of them, but you started the process. Harris started the process, and why?
And it would be fair to say that Harris did it, despite some of the advice of the folks engaged in the file. So you may remember something called smog. Yeah. And so before there was the idea that carbon was a pollutant, there were actual pollutants, and they were a problem, and they were causing sustained, lasting health consequences for folks, and especially for our seniors. So the Drive Clean program and a whole bunch of other programs that Harris implemented to help mitigate the consequences of smog, that was a big deal. And coal was clearly part of that equation because the stuff we were producing up at Nanticoke was sweeping all the way down into the U.S. And so the process to start getting rid of coal was driven more, I think, by old-fashioned environmentalist attitudes. And Mike was an old-fashioned environmentalist. The parkland expansion, the Oak Ridges Moraine, and getting rid of smog would have been higher on his list than the idea that carbon was a pollutant and we had to save the world by stopping the creation of these things. But in the end, the timing was the only issue that McGuinty had a big input in. He said, "You're not closing the coal fast enough, and I will close it faster." And it was closed on the date that Harris had originally announced. That's how politics works. 2007 is what we knew could be done. 2007 is what was done. But in the meantime, McGuinty and the Liberals successfully wrapped themselves in the achiever category, and dark, satanic, mill-loving Harris was left back in the old history. Again, all the reasons to write 25 or 30 years later a more balanced evaluation of somebody with so many lasting impacts.
Okay, so let's troll through some of these policy matters. I'm going to start with the one I'm most familiar with, which is the fiscal record. And one of the promises in the Common Sense Revolution was to balance the budget. And by 1995, this was not a controversial notion anymore. Every government in the Western world was trying to do this, and of every ideological or political stripe. So it was math. Deficit reduction was math. But unlike the federal Liberals or most of those other governments, you cut taxes at the same time. So you take office and you're confronted with, by any historical standard, an unmanageable deficit in the province of Ontario. And the first thing you do is cut your revenue. Why?
So the thought process was that lower marginal income tax rates would create economic incentive for more economic activity and more job creation. It was a conservative thought process attached all the way back to...
But you'd seen the Laffer curve blow up the U.S. deficit.
Yeah, the combination of the tax cuts and the defense spending, I think, together did that.
Okay.
I don't think at the time we believed that the Laffer curve had been disproved. I actually still believe it today, just so you know.
Okay.
The thought process was embedded in our approach, and it was validated by the idea that Ray had tried to raise taxes on income multiple times with less and less revenue coming in. So we'd hit some kind of ceiling on spending. That was clear. We couldn't borrow too much more. We were losing our credit rating. We'd hit a debt ceiling, but we'd also hit a tax ceiling. And so we didn't have oil revenue like Newfoundland or Alberta or the oil natural gas blessings of Saskatchewan. We actually had to do this on our own.
But wait a second, just in fairness, Ontario had an economy that was roaring out of recession into recovery. And I know this because it was a huge factor in the elimination of the federal deficit as well. Sure, the cuts were hugely important, but revenue soared.
I think that's fair. So timing is everything in politics. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think it would also be fair to point out just what a valuable contribution free trade made to that. And I know how hard you campaigned against it and how much you served up its success afterwards. So I think in the end, Ontario had dual problems and we felt we had to tackle them both. And timing, maybe. Good luck, maybe. But 725,000 net new jobs was what we had in the econometric model, which we had built as the underpinning to the platform. And that's exactly what Ontario produced in that 5-year period. And kept going from there.
So was the belief that, and maybe this is a distinction without a difference, but I'm interested for some reason, was the belief that you needed to lower taxes to unlock the economy, or was the belief just that people are paying too much taxes? Like this is just an unreasonable, usurious amount of tax for people to pay.
Yeah. So I think the platform was written by people who believed the former, but the government was partly elected by people who believed the latter.
Right.
So the combination, I think, was what was compelling.
What's the enduring legacy of those tax cuts?
Well, I think you describe it as having a lasting impact in the final reflections in your chapter. I think you describe it as fundamentally making tax increases political anathema. And that had an impact in Ontario, where Dalton McGuinty had to sign the tax pledge. knowing in his heart that he would immediately break it. But federally, it had a consistent impact too. You described how most folks in Ottawa today on the Liberal side think that HST could be 2 points higher and it would be better for humanity, but it would be fatal to say so out loud.
Yeah.
So honestly, if Trudeau wanted to call for that now, that would be great. I think the reality is that we did fundamentally embed the idea that there was too much limit for taxes. And I don't think there'd be too many of the folks on our team who regret that. There's lots government could do to spend that money that it does take better. And I think focusing itself more effectively on service delivery in a narrow range and then working out how to do public-private partnerships on more. I think there's lots of room for government to do a better job with what it takes in now, but there should be a cap. And somewhere psychically, David, when you get over a 50% marginal tax rate, bad things happen to economies. Entrepreneurs do choose to move. They do choose to build their businesses elsewhere. 50% is too high. And we had got to over 50%, and Mike Harris took it below that number, and that yielded better outcomes, honestly, in terms of economic growth and job creation. So I believe that today. I think it's one of the proudest lasting legacies of that time.
So as we speak, Ontario spends less per capita, less per person. The Ontario government spends less per person than any other government in Canada does. Is that a good thing?
So the practical question would be, is that because they're effectively leveraging scale? Or is it because
no, it's because you capped their revenue.
Or is it because they're underspending? And my instinct is that the scale advantages in Ontario, concentrated population, larger population, ability to spread your fixed costs across a broader group could legitimately enable what you've described and not have it as a bad thing. So most Canadian provinces still have to deal with more dispersed populations. We have such a giant chunk in the GTA that you should be able to spread your fixed costs for government services across a much bigger group and still deliver just as well. So I don't regard by itself factoid as something to be alarmed about. I just think it would be a practical question of why is that number like that, not, oh my gosh, that's awful.
Okay, so let me take it up another 10,000 feet. You reduce taxes, which is an inherently popular thing. But did the question of what people want to pay and what people expect from government, did those two tensions ever get resolved? Because my suspicion is that you were more effective at reducing taxes than you were at reducing the government's appetite, the public's appetite for government services.
So I think when an individual is looking for services, most particularly in healthcare, the demand is infinite because you're sick or someone in your family is. But at a high level, those same voters, and we pulled on this all the time, would agree that more than 30% of government spending was waste. That number would be consistent today, and that number would be consistent across voters for all parties. And so there is an important difference between how people think selfishly about their desire for government spending when they particularly need something in forms of service delivery, and how they think about government in general. And those both can be right. I think both of us probably have an instinct that there's quite a lot that government could do more efficiently and better than it's doing. But you might not think 30% of government spending is waste, but you might think it's a number, and you might think it's a double-digit number, and
I think what I think is that all large organizations have waste in them, and that it is inherent to a very, very large bureaucracy that there's going to be waste in there, and they can't root it out of IBM, and you can't root it out of the government of Canada or Ontario.
But every cycle, I got to run a couple of billion-dollar corporations in my career, and there's always room to find 5 or 10%. And so every once in a while you do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that same rigor has been applied to the Ontario government since Harris.
Right.
And I don't think it would be unhealthy for systems to go through those kinds of reviews all the time. There is always inefficiency, you're right. And that's true of public sector and private sector. But what are we doing about it in the public sector on a regular basis, I think would be a fair question. Part of how we got through COVID was massive increases in headcount, provincial and federal, and other parts of the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to discover there's quite a lot of expense load and not that much noticeable improvement in the quality of service. There's room to do better.
Okay. Welfare. Yeah. Welfare. I've been privileged in my life never to need this service. One of the popular elements of the common sense revolution was a 20% reduction in welfare rates. Why was that a target? I mean, other than politically, substantively, policy-wise, let's looking at the common sense revolution as a policy document rather than a political document. Why was that a target?
So the political arithmetic, if we were committed to not cutting healthcare, which we were, and we didn't, was that you had to find the savings in education and social welfare spending. So that was, just the unfair arithmetic of where do you find the cuts? What are the big line items?
Yeah.
But in the case of welfare, there really was a very interesting public policy problem in Ontario. We had 1.3 million on the welfare caseload in a province of not yet 11 million people.
1 out of 8. 1 out of 8 working age people, or something like that.
It was just an extraordinary thing, and it was why there was such an appetite for change. Was because this was not the Ontario people had been born and raised in. I mean, Ontario always went last grudgingly into recession, led Canada out of them again. And this time we went in first headlong and came out last behind Newfoundland. I mean, it was a very challenging time, and the welfare caseload levels were very high. But interestingly, they had been climbing nonstop for a sustained period. They had been climbing from 85 to 90 when times were quite good. Mm-hmm. Welfare compensation levels had been increased during that period under Peterson, and people had responded by signing up. And so obviously when the recession hit, that number kept climbing. But even in 93, when, as you described, things started to improve in Ontario's economy, the welfare caseloads kept climbing. And so there was something out of whack with what we were paying that was leading people to choose what we would normally think of as being a particularly unappetizing and last desperate recourse, to choose it instead of work or to choose it on top of underground economy work. And it was the last part of that led to so much of the political tension, because the folks who were paying those 50% plus tax rates were living next door to folks who were on welfare but working in the underground economy as well. And they could see the income disparity, and it wasn't working for them. So there was a lot of intensity to the view. We reduced welfare levels to level 10% above the provincial average of the rest of Canada. We did nothing that was awful. We simply rebalanced what was paid. And if you believe that people respond to incentives, as I suspect we both do, we announced the implementation of the cuts in June, as soon as we were elected, but they didn't go into effect until September. Welfare caseloads started falling in July before any changes to the compensation levels, and didn't stop falling all the way through the Harris era.
Right.
And they got down to a much more reasonable 500,000 or so at the end of that period, regardless of the ups and downs in the economic cycle. We had, I think, successfully rebalanced what you could make as an able-bodied citizen off welfare relative to work. And we had also, I think, created a few other harder edge elements to this. The work for welfare stuff was giving people a clear trade-off. And if you're going to work for welfare, or you could work in a job that might pay a little better, but maybe you have to work harder or have to commute a little bit further, people made those trade-offs and made those informed decisions. And all of that yielded a dramatically reduced cost in our community and social services budget. And honestly, people with a job is better than people on welfare. It's better for the system and it's better for the people.
So listen, if we're talking about scammers, I got no truck or trade with those people. But I do have a question for you that you must have thought about when you were pondering this, which is when you're thinking about somebody that actually needs that service, welfare, not somebody that's trying to game it, but somebody that actually needs it. How well should they live?
So if we believe that welfare is compensation provided by the community as a last resort, it can't be too attractive. And it had become, I think we argued successfully and proved conclusively, it had become too attractive.
Okay.
What is the right number and where is the threshold? You can debate. And around the edges of any
But
threshold,
you can't, the reason I ask is you can't live on it right now. So it sort of raises the question of what the point of it is, right? Like you get $10,000 a year if you're a single male, able-bodied person. 10,000. What am I going to do with that?
Yeah. So I think the practical question of the correct levels today, I have not spent any of my last 20 years paying any attention to.
Right.
And obviously, if they should be higher, there were governments of the liberal persuasion for 15 years that could have done something about it.
No question.
And I think the reality is that's often not the only recourse. There's family, there's friends, there are charities, there are other networks of support. And so I'm not being some hard-edged, crazed caveman conservative here to say that at the edges around any threshold, there's going to be human suffering, and that's just true. But at a government level, the changes we made totally worked and ended up with less poverty, more people working, and working meaningful jobs is better than sitting sadly and taking welfare that might not be enough to get by.
Right.
I don't think we apologize for all the jobs that we created through the changes we made. Better for the system and better net for humanity, I hope.
Right. Education was one of the most controversial public policy areas. In fact, Kathleen Wynne has often said publicly that Mike Harris's education policies got her into politics. You had 20,000 teachers protesting at Maple Leaf Gardens. You had a 2-week province-wide strike. And the Liberals believed that ultimately they rode education back to power in 2003 as an issue. What were you trying to do in education, and what was the net result?
So we were obsessed with the arithmetic around the balanced budget target. But we were also very unhappy with the quality of education. And so the lasting legacy of Harris in that checklist of policy areas would include the fundamentally revised core curriculum, which was a public good. And
revised in what way?
Largely still there. We restated the requirements for reading and writing and arithmetic. And that stuff, maybe Kathleen Wynne got into politics to change something we were doing, but she didn't change that.
Right.
We introduced measurements and metrics, including standardized testing in grade 3, grade 6, grade 9, and a required literacy test in grade 10 before you could graduate. Things which have been softened around the edges, lamentably. But those results still happen and published by school. which we really thought was important to give parents more insight as to the quality of the education their kids were receiving. As Bill Robson from the C.D. Howe beautifully teases out in his chapter in the Harris Legacy book, the results in the internationally measured exams for literacy and arithmetic ability improved through the period of Harris. And all we were asking was the teachers spend more time in the classroom. And we were trying to get them to something closer to the average of what teachers spend in the classroom in every other province in Canada. And that is what the unions were protesting. And so I believe that the Liberals are right. And in 2003, education was critical. What they promised is that they would buy peace. And they could afford to, thanks to Mike Harris. But buying peace with the teachers' unions is a temporary measure when they are in perpetual war.
Right.
And I don't think they were doing any favors to Premier Wynne by the time she was done.
Right.
So she may have got in to do good things for education, and she may have thought the teachers' unions were her allies, but they're nobody's allies but their own. In the end, I think the changes we made in education around the curriculum and around the measurement of performance were meaningful and lasting, and include the work we did in post-secondary, including moving to 4 years instead of 5, which was obviously a thing if you're the teachers just trying to manage the total number of union members, which was totally normal for the rest of Canada and totally worked. And then we funded the post-secondary system to absorb that double cohort quite effectively. And the system is better off for all of those Harris changes. So obviously, if you're a status quo lover, Mike was not for you. But on education, as on welfare, as on healthcare, which you haven't raised yet, the Harris legacy is lasting, and I would argue net positive.
We'll talk about healthcare. I don't know much about that area. So, what were you doing in healthcare? So the number one thing was that throughout the whole developed world, the number of people who needed intensive care, overnight care in hospitals was falling. Medicine was changing. Drugs were changing. The way surgeries were performed was changing. And so we had this dramatic decline in the number of required beds. And we were still opening hospitals. They were popular. Politicians could have a shovel. They could have a ribbon cutting. So even as the number of active beds declined, not a single hospital was closed. So the largest single change in the Harris regime, as articulated by good Liberal Will Falk in his chapter in the Harris Legacy book, is implementing the recommendations of the Hospital Restructuring Commission. And we closed 40 uneconomic hospitals. Obviously, the politics of the time, if you're in opposition, you oppose. These were all awful changes, apparently. And Harris took his hits for each one of those closures in the riding or jurisdiction where that was located. How many of those were reopened? None. And the obvious reason is because it was the right thing to do. That money was reinvested in the new super regional hospitals. It was invested in the massive increase in infrastructure and budget for the specialty corridor down University Avenue, which services the whole province and has world-leading capabilities. The change management exercise, once again, was an example of Harris being the leader ready to rip off the Band-Aid and take that short-term pain to get to a better outcome. And Will, in his very balanced chapter, suggests we deserve an A on hospital restructuring and an A- overall in healthcare, and that Harris was a good healthcare premier. Yeah, that's right.
If there's a single chapter in the book that makes me most satisfied, I would say it's having an external, not Tory observer correctly articulate the way Harris was ready to make long-term decisions and absorb short-term political consequences because it was the right thing to do. And the healthcare chapter articulates beautifully that in this area, as in others, that's the legacy of Mike Harris.
You had understood, though, the brand challenge facing conservatives on healthcare because you felt obliged in the common sense revolution to go out of your way to reassure people that you wouldn't be cutting healthcare. Because there's just some brand issues here. If a Liberal Party announces that it's going to be doing a review of tax policy, people assume taxes are going up. If the Conservatives decide they're going to do a review of healthcare, people decide healthcare spending going down, right? So did you factor that in the implementation that your motives were going to be suspect all the time?
I think we had to accept that they would be, and that there was nothing you could really do to change that. And so we promised to seal the healthcare envelope, so the net total dollars spent didn't go down. But we certainly believed we needed to reallocate that spending, which is what the hospital closures enabled us to do.
Right.
And we did. We honored our promise over that 5-year period. But there was no doubt there was going to be political consequences, and we paid them. We went into the second election in 99 down in the polls, and changes like that were clearly on people's minds when they thought about whether Harris should be reelected. And in the end, they concluded that the leader ready to rip off all those Band-Aids, but tell in advance that he was going to do that, and then do it, was better than somebody who just gave the traditional promises of, oh, we won't be bad.
Right.
And we won a second big majority against the full concentrated firepower of the public sector unions, and who outspent us in the advertising fundamentally, like 2 times, I think.
Right.
So you're right. We had brand issues. We also had a premier and a team that had targets that they were aiming at: balanced budget, tax cuts, 725,000 new jobs, and believed in the mission. And so they were ready to take the short-term hits. And again, obviously it was terrible politics at the time, but if it was such a bad thing to do, how come nobody reopened those places? And
right.
They just didn't.
Right. So you told me at the start that you wrote the book because you don't want Mike Harris to be remembered only for Walkerton and Ipperwash. So what do you want him to be remembered for? And don't give me a long list, because even the Rolling Stones are only going to get remembered for 5 songs at the end of the day. So what is your satisfaction in Honky Tonk Woman?
Mike Harris was elected with a comprehensive platform of change for Ontario. He did exactly what he promised, and it worked.
So none of the specifics, just that overall, you want to be remembered as a guy that was transformational.
Yeah. If you think about Ontario politicians, they get remembered for a thing. If they're good ones, like Bill Davis is remembered for creating the community college system when he was a minister for education. But most politicians are remembered only for the thing that causes them to leave politics.
Right.
And that's not fair. It's not fair to Paul Martin that he is remembered for the sponsor gate or whatever it was called. It's not fair to lots of politicians. But you can choose to be a transactional politician, or you can choose to be a transformational politician. There's folks who just tackle what comes on their desk, and they aren't remembered for much. The folks who choose to be transformational is a shorter list. And Mike, unexpectedly by many, turned out to be one of those. And with a much broader vision of fundamental change successfully implemented, and as it turns out, lasting. And so there's lots of stuff to do in the next generation of Ontario's political challenges. But the Ontario that we've got now, across almost every major design sector, is the Harris legacy.
Right. Right. Speaking of leaving politics, why did you leave politics for all intents and purposes after Mike Harris retired?
Well, I think if you have campaigns like 95 and 99, it's tough to top that. I did some quite hard volunteer work helping reunify the Federal Conservative Party and was involved in some platform development during that period. But I had always committed to myself that I was going to have politics as a hobby, not a career. I was blessed with the opportunity over my life to have disproportionate impact on public policy, but still make a private sector income and have the work-life balance. I mean, I guess as a CEO, I didn't have too much of that, but I had more than you have as a politician. People don't appreciate just how tough a job elected office is.
But didn't you have a feeling that you were like pretty good at it? You know, like there's a lot of mopes who can run an insurance company, but there aren't many people who can do what you did.
I think political campaigns is a young person's game. And I think you know that too. I think there's a period where you have the energy level, the ambition, and the self-confidence, some of that because of ignorance, to just go for it. And I think both you and I at young ages got to have disproportionate impact on the way our provinces and our country ran. And it was very, very satisfying. But that's also, there's a shelf life to that. And so I feel like I'd already used up most of my good news on that area by the time the second term was done. And I don't have any regrets about what I did then. A network of friends that will last to my end, and memories of very satisfying moments. But in the end, what this book was about is, you know, you're asking yourself as our ages advance, you know, was I a net positive or negative to humanity?
Yeah.
And I had a group of academics and journalists and partisans and liberals and even a Green, chapter by chapter, suggest that the work I was part of was mostly okay. And that I think I will take some comfort in. So to that degree, buying a copy of this book is just satisfying Alister's selfish need for validation and self-esteem. But I think it's way more important than that. If you're thinking about the problems of today, David, it's so easy to think they're intractable, that no one person can change things for the better. And the problems of the 80s and 90s in Ontario and Canada were pretty huge and felt to many to be intractable. And perhaps the most profound... The
fiscal issues were seen to be intractable.
Oh, everything was first paragraph of the Common Sense Revolution. You will maybe not have read recently, but the final sentence of that is, the system is broken. First paragraph. And so that might be familiar to you now. And so if you think about just how challenging it all was, what's maybe exciting is that a local MPP from North Bay could come to Queen's Park and show that one individual can actually make a difference. And I think what you and I both know about Canada's political system is that it works most of the time, and that good people can advance and move the needle. But a lot of folks are doubting that these days. Harris turned out to be one of the most profoundly consequential political leaders this country's produced, as this book evidences. But I think people can take comfort today that if they sign up and commit and want to do good things, the Canada we live in today can be made better, and the challenges we face can be tackled. And I hope there's a message of hope in that.
It's awesome. Would you hold up the book so people can see it?
Well, I don't know whether the camera will do it justice with the big bright light there. Maybe
Let me
not.
see. Somewhere in there's a focus. Anyway, so it's published by, let's close by this. It's published by Sunderland House. Would you give our good friend Ken White a plug? Probably people don't know the good work he's doing over there.
Yeah, so Ken and the team at Sutherland House are built over the last 4 years a brand new independent publisher who specializes in Canadian nonfiction. It is an area where discussion around our country and the issues it faces, so many excellent authors producing so much work. It's very hard to sell a book these days. There's fewer bookstores. Even the bookstores that are would rather sell blankets than candles. And so to have a publishing house brave enough to set up shop and just pound out quality nonfiction publications, it's worth supporting. There's a thing called the Sutherland Quarterly. You can just sign up, and every quarter they mail you a mini book of really good stuff by Paul Wells or somebody. Signing up for Ken's Shush newsletter, signing up for the Sutherland Quarterly, and buying a copy of the Harris Legacy and one other thing on the site. I recommend you to do that. It would be good for Canada.
Excellent.
How is that?
It is perfect. Alister, thanks for this. It was most interesting. Really appreciate your time on this, and great initiative to have written this book.
Thank you for your own contribution. Very brave of you and much appreciated.
Thanks. Hey, give my love to Colleen, would you?
I promise. Cheers.
All right. Take care. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and I'd like to thank our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who watched or listened today. And of course, a special thanks to Alister Campbell for joining us. Until next week, take care of yourselves.
Herle